We're here with Rick Snyder, the former governor of Michigan, who I'm excited to see again. It's been a little bit, but I used to cover him and see him all the time around Lansing and the Capitol, of course. Thanks for joining us.
It's great to be with you, Emily, and it's great to be with Malachi.
Yeah. We started off this project. We're kicking it off thinking about bipartisanship and really sort of the lack of it that we've seen around Lansing and around Michigan over the last few years. And I guess, we wanted to ask first sort of what drives your interest in that topic and how do you think about that issue?
Well, it's one of the biggest issues facing our nation and us as Americans. And I put it in most of my speeches. I actually consciously talked about the need for civility for many years. And why did I do that? It's simple. I don't want to understate it. I'll put it in context. I believe it's one of the greatest threats to our country. If you want to be the greatest country in the world, and we've held that status for many, many years, you cannot maintain it if you can't get along with yourself. And if you look at, we have some serious threats in terms of other countries and issues with nuclear weapons, and we have COVID and everything else. But ultimately, you come back to us ourselves and say, if we can't get along, how do you expect us to continue to provide the best outcomes for our citizens of today and for the children of the future? And so I think it's among the most important topics we should have on the table.
I think one of the key things that we're trying to understand is how has this breakdown in civility and the ability of both parties to work together on issues, how has that disrupted our government's ability to solve problems, and what kind of roadblocks has that created to creating progress in our state? Where do you think we can go from here on that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So it is a huge problem. It is a huge issue because, again, if you're not working together, are you getting anything done to solve serious issues? Again, I adopted my own personal philosophy. Emily will tell you, she got tired of hearing it. It was relentless positive action, which is a simple philosophy. No blame, no credit. What's the problem? What's the solution? And get it done and be relentless in pursuit of solutions. The current environment we have now is about divisiveness. It's about saying somebody's going to win and someone's going to lose. And that's unhealthy. I mean, the goal of anything should be to win-win. How do you come up with situations where people all benefit? And again, there may be different relative weightings of that, but how do you move it forward in a constructive, positive way where people come out ahead? And that gets back to the role of government. And again, that feeds this divisiveness. Too often politicians are sort of looking at their careers, or they're career politicians, or they're trying to advance. And their advancement is dependent on having a finite group of people that are rabid supporters of theirs, promoting them. And then they look at it to say, well, I got to do something for these supporters, and not necessarily trying to represent all the people that are in their constituency. That's a big problem. We need to overcome that. My view of government, because I came from the outside, was it was always interesting. I was into customer service. It was funny. I'd meet with people, and people always get impressed, almost always impressed with meeting a governor. So they're very deferential. Usually they're very nice. They're going out of their way to do special things for you. And I look at them and I said, do you understand? I work for you. I'm here to serve you and the other 10 million people in our state. So please, I appreciate it. I love it. It's very nice of you, but let's talk about how we can work together to solve some problem.
So you sort of came into office with that philosophy. Like, I remember relentless positive action from very early on. I would say day one in office. You can correct me if I'm wrong. But relentless positive action, dog years, I remember, and even like the issues that you would go, like the special messages around the state, were really like pragmatic, data-driven looks that sort of took the politicization out of a lot of the big issues that Michigan was facing. So, you came from outside of government. You weren't a career politician. So where did that instinct to help people work together come from? Like, prior to being governor, were there experiences that you had in the private sector or in your personal life that made you take that approach?
Yeah, I've always taken that approach, and I learned it from mentors. I had early mentors in my career, and I can go way back to the 1980s. My first position at Coopers and Lybrand when I was a tax accountant. How's that for exciting? So I'm out doing work for people, but one thing I learned from people, particularly a gentleman named Jerry Wolf and another one, John Heitman, were two partners there. And they taught me about customer service. And the part of customer service that I viewed as unique is we would go service clients. But we also worked with a lot of different staff people. You had many different bosses, depending on what engagement or what client you had. And what I learned to do was treat everyone as a customer. And I think that's something that too often doesn't happen in business still, where you'll see people treat people differently. If you work for somebody, you always be nice to them. But if they work for you, too often people don't treat those people with the same level of respect. And that's not right. So one thing I always learned, Emily, was to say everyone deserves it. I mean, that's the fundamentals you learn if you look at our value system is shouldn't everyone get treated with the same level of respect, and you try to help people. And that's
Emily was telling me, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's missing too much in our system today. A great illustration is, and if you go back and look, when I was campaigning the first time, I was campaigning in Detroit, and I was talking about the need to bring back Detroit back in 2009, 2010. And people thought I was crazy because they're going, you're not going to get any real votes out of the city of Detroit. I opened up a campaign office in Detroit. And my point is that I understand I may not get many votes, but I'm there to represent 10 million Michiganders, and those 600,000 people in Detroit are part of that. So they deserve service just as much as anyone else in the state of Michigan. And I should be sensitive to that and thoughtful to that. Versus today's environment too often is you're seeing too many political people say, these are my constituents, I'm going to deliver something for them. And if you're not part of that team, tough. It's like, you're not in charge now, so, good luck. That's terrible, because that's not service. That's being political. Service is about governing. And if you're going to govern, you have to be responsible to every citizen, whether they voted for you or not, whether you like them or not, wherever they live or not. You're there to deliver, a better outcome and hopefully a win-win.
To that point, it becoming this electoral strategy to kind of narrow down on your base of supporters and maybe, specifically cater your message toward them. You would think that it might be more successful to kind of build a broad coalition, reach out to people that don't agree with you, kind of build some bipartisan consensus around things. Why do you think our elections have kind of gone the other way?
Sorry, I was trying to X out of a sound and I've invited more sound.
Yeah, to go to your question, and it's a really great question. I'm not sure I have the perfect answer, the full answer, but there are 2 or 3 contributing factors that I think leads to this. One of the problems we have is how we elect people to office. And that's about the primary system, for example, and about how we do apportionment, how we decide who's in what districts. Because if you look at the maps quite often, and this is a big controversy, but many of the seats are relatively safe seats. So people view the election as the primary. So it's not about the general election. They consider that pretty safe. And you can't take it for granted, but if you win the primary, you're going to win the general. I don't think that helps matters, because it drives people to say, what issues, what do I need to go tell people I stand for in this primary that may be to one of the extremes? And this is true of both parties. One nice thing that I enjoyed running statewide is there was no district where it was apportioned. Because Michigan is one of those wonderful states. I view it as, if you win every Republican in the state of Michigan and nobody else, you lose. If you win every Democrat in the state of Michigan and nobody else, you lose. So you have to appeal to the middle. And that's my natural constituency. So I enjoyed that. So this primary system is part of it. A second feature, I think, in many ways, is social media. Social media is not a positive when it comes to these things. Again, it tends to be that echo chamber where people tend to go to places that reinforce a limited belief, and people don't even understand the other side of an issue. And the same thing for media. And again, you guys are real journalists. And I'm not trying to go after the media, because people have self-selected and created this channel. So media didn't do it themselves. People did that. But if you go in these nighttime shows, that if you look, they're sort of talking about this as news, they're commentators. They're not journalists. They're not reporters. They're not reporting facts. They're giving you their opinion. And people tend to go listen to the ones that reinforce what they already believe. It was really interesting. One thing that I think we really have lost were town halls. I did hundreds of town halls. I love town halls. But to do a town hall today is a scary concept because there's liable to be a small minority of people that are going to show up and shout you down. Where most people coming to the town hall, they really want to listen. The average person coming is really looking for information. And when I ran, it was a wonderful opportunity. And I used to tell people, I had a couple of classics. I remember one in particular up in the Marquette area. I went to this place for a town hall and the entire front row was sitting there with their arms crossed like this. And so by definition, when I even looked at there, I said, I got an uphill situation going here because obviously these people aren't thrilled and they're skeptics. But it was really cool because they took the time to listen to what I had to say. And I know more than half that front row were going to end up voting for me because they had misinformation, they didn't have the facts, and they got to listen how I thought about issues and how I was trying to provide service. So, losing things like that have a high price for us.
One of the things we're trying to get at is what exactly that price is. And, you have some experience in economic development and venture capital. And also as governor, I remember you trying to make Michigan an appealing business environment for companies to come into. Is there something inherently unappealing for businesses looking to expand or locate in Michigan? If there's a bunch of divisiveness and if people can't seem to get on the same page about things between our political parties?
Yeah, absolutely. When it comes to economic development, one of the fundamentals is consistency and teamwork. As you mentioned, Emily, I've been doing economic development work for decades, long before I became governor. And the number one rule I tell people, and I used to tell local areas this when I was governor, I said, we can do great things at the state. And we did. We went from a bottom 10 state to a top 10 state in terms of, job creation environment. But if they didn't have their act together, I couldn't help them. Because if you think about it, if you're in an area or going to a new area, are you going to be excited? Are you going to want to go there or stay there if you see people fighting with one another, the people that are supposed to be providing you service? It's just human nature. You're not going to put up with it. So the divisiveness in particular is a problem, but the other problem that goes with it, and even more subtle, is the need for consistency. If you're in business, you want to know there's a consistent level playing field and that it's going to be there for an extended period of time. And your greatest concern is, even if you don't like the rules, if they're fairly applied to everyone and you know what they are, you can work within that constraint. If they're going to keep changing on you and bouncing around, or be slanted to say, well, we're going to give better treatment to this group versus this group, they're just going to be looking to say, well, maybe I may win this time, but I'm going to lose next time. So that's a nuance that most people don't think about. In addition to the divisiveness, for good economic development, you need a glide path that says you're going to be consistent and stable over a significant time period. And that's what is attractive to people.
I want to go back to what you were saying earlier about disagreement on the basic facts. That seems like a pretty difficult hurdle to overcome when you go to a town hall and you're talking with somebody about an issue and there's just a fundamental disagreement about, the basic foundation of what's happening. And, we think to a lot of recent examples like the 2020 election, the COVID pandemic. It seems like we really do kind of live in pretty distinct realities in terms of, what information seems true to us. How do we break that down? That seems like a pretty big, societal problem and probably one bigger than we're able to solve in this conversation, but how do we get started on that?
Yeah, a lot of it is giving people examples that they can appreciate, that resonate in their life. And actually, I'll cite, I had a wonderful Lieutenant Governor, Brian Calley's a great guy, and he would talk about civility, and he had a great story, and I can't do it true justice, but his civility story was about his marriage, about getting along with his wife, Julie, and about how it was about compromise versus coming into a relationship saying, you know, I'm right, and the next time an issue comes up, I'm right, and the next time an issue comes up, I'm right. Can you imagine doing that in your relationship more than once and having a happy relationship? I mean, you're going to be in trouble pretty quick on that path. So he used to describe it in terms of his, you know, relationship with his wife. That's something that most of us can relate to. So a lot of it is, these can be very complicated things where the facts can get confusing to people, or it can take too long to get all the facts out to people, you know, before they want to move on. But if you can bring it back to something that resonates in their life, it makes a difference. So for example, when I talked economic development, I traditionally brought it back to jobs and your livelihood. And when I ran the first time, a huge issue to me personally, but to everyone in Michigan, is I was running not just for the people today, because we were at the bottom. We were 50 out of 50, but we were having our young people leave the state in droves. And I viewed it as our mandate was to turn it around, and we did. So we were having net inbound migration of people your age and bringing people here. And if you look at the facts, that was incredible. And that's something that resonated to everyone, even if they didn't have kids. It was interesting to watch that one in particular, where you'd have empty nesters or people that never had kids. They still cared about saying young people were either staying or leaving in Michigan. So I think we need to get back to that kind of fundamental question.
You're not the first person to make that analogy to a marriage. That's interesting.
Well, I view it, I know, I've got a wonderful relationship with Sue, and she is always right.
She is. That tracks with my experience with her. But so, you know, one thing I want to touch base with you about is sort of what is the state of the Republican Party right now, and does it look different than it did when you chose to run as a Republican in 2010?
Yeah, I would say both parties are very polarized. I mean, I think it's true of both issues. I think they're somewhat different, but there's similarities that they've gone to the extremes even more. And I want to put it in context a little bit, because if you go back to my time, the Tea Party was a big issue. That was a huge topic. I always thought it was interesting. The Tea Party came in and their pitch was we got to get career politicians out. We got to get these government people out. We got to have new things. We got to have new thinking people from the outside. I came in from the outside and they didn't necessarily love me. So that was sort of a contrast. But I appreciated the general thought, but that's started some of the divisiveness though. In the Republican Party, I would say the issue there is it's become too much a party of personality and not enough party of principle. And again, people want to associate with a set of principles. And right now it's more, if you affiliate with personalities, particularly the president, you're viewed in one area. If you don't associate with that personality, you're not. Where in the old days, I mean, I still believe in the Republican Party, which is more limited government, again, customer service government, fiscal responsibility, giving solutions to people, creating an environment where free enterprise works, and growing the pie so everyone can share in a larger economic opportunity. And I think the Democrats, on the other hand, have gone, you know, very far to the left with the progressive movement.
We seem to see, you know, in the primaries that are kind of shaping up in Michigan right now, a lot of the candidates and some of the grassroots supporters are kind of engaging in these purity tests around you know, their support of the former president, their support of, you know, looking more into the election and things like that. And it seems to be kind of, you know, they want to push out some of the more moderate members that are perhaps more interested in working with Democrats, or, you know, being a little bit more in the middle and on some of these issues. Why do you think that's happening? And where is that left, you know, Republicans like yourself that came forward to endorse Joe Biden in the last election and you know, don't seem to be as thrilled with that kind of cult of personality that you touched on?
Yeah, I think the real answer is we should just follow our beliefs and hold our ground in terms of that. And the way the context I'd put it in is I was proud to serve, as an honor to serve as Michigan's governor for 8 years. And I'll put my track record up to say, look at what we accomplished. I mean, we accomplished far more than the federal government has accomplished in decades in terms of tangible outcomes, things passing, things getting done, and largely bipartisan, to show great results. And isn't that what governance is about? One of the things people forget too often, and we haven't talked about this yet, it's harder to govern than to be against something, to be in the minority. It's easy to be in the minority and be negative. It's hard to govern if you really want to govern, because governing by definition means you're going to compromise. And again, this is part of that problem with divisiveness, is compromise has become a dirty word too often. And if you're viewed as compromising, you've sold out and you're going to get attacked. And I compromised on a regular basis. And the way I viewed it is, I was not giving up my values. I was giving up an opportunity to accomplish even more, but that doesn't mean I was giving up on it. That's relentless positive action. That's where the relentless part of positive action came from, is we proposed very aggressive things. I mean, you can go back to our policy papers. We got people's attention because of these special messages pushing the envelope. And I didn't get all of it in any of them, I don't think, but quite often we get 50%, 80%. Isn't that a huge positive movement? And the way I defined it is, if you can work with someone and do it in a bipartisan fashion or a nonpartisan fashion where you get an outcome, and if I got 50 or 80%, that showed we could agree on a lot. If you come back to that remaining 20 or 50%, you now have a track record of showing how you could work together, and it's going to be easier to get half of what's left of that. Are you ever going to get the 99th percentile? Well, maybe no, maybe not to even the 90th. But if you are relentless in pursuing it in a thoughtful way, again, not a confrontational way, you can achieve tremendous results. And that's the way I viewed it. And that's how I believe we have a better system in terms of how we operate it. And one thing I'll remind people of, and this point should be in a message that always comes out that doesn't enough, is I used to keep track of all the bills that I signed into law. And I used to keep track of how many of those bills were bipartisan. Because people spend all their time on the lightning rod issues, the controversial stuff, and some of those are the bigger issues. But I kept track of every bill, and I asked our team in legislative affairs to tell me what percent of the bills passed with a majority of both parties in both chambers. So it had to have more than half Republicans and Democrats in each chamber to do that. And that percentage was in the low 90%. Think about that. I mean, so if you listen to the whole dialogue, it's all about this other stuff where 90% of the stuff, and some of these weren't as significant, but they're still important, passed with big majorities of both parties. Why aren't we talking about stuff that we got done?
Well, I actually want to talk about stuff that you got done. I'm wondering if you have a thing or two that sticks out in your mind as something that would have been impossible without getting both parties or members of both parties on the same page.
Yeah, I have two illustrations that stand out to me. One would be Healthy Michigan, which is bringing healthcare. It brought healthcare to over 600,000 Michiganders at the time. Today, that number is over 900,000. And these are people that have improved the quality of life. But literally, I believe there are thousands to tens of thousands that are alive today that may not be alive today, but for that legislation. I mean, you got to feel good about that. And that was bipartisan because we had the whole issue about Obamacare. And so I never called it that. It was the Affordable Care Act. And then we added a front end that added more for personal responsibility and wellness. But we did it in a bipartisan fashion. The second one would be the Detroit Bankruptcy. I mean, that was a case where history is to get everybody in Michigan to support a whole bunch of money going to the city of Detroit was unheard of. I mean, if you brought that up in general conversation for several decades before that, you'd be told you were nuts. And we got it done. And it wasn't, when I say we, it wasn't me, it was collectively as Michiganders. We did it.
Both those issues, though, it seems like you had to extend your personal capital on, right? Like you had to get people to follow what you thought was the right course of action. How hard was that at times to sort of put yourself out there for those issues and collect support from such a broad coalition?
Yeah, well, that's what governing is about. It's not about you. It's about interacting with ways where they can appreciate where you're coming from, so they want to join you. And that was hard. It took a lot of work, and it didn't always work. I mean, the classic case is we did a massive program eventually on infrastructure, but that took 2 or 3 years. Roads, the famous roads issue in Michigan. So a lot of the improvements you're seeing is the result of the stuff we did back then that's now kicked in fully. But one of the cases didn't work. So I couldn't get it done the way I wanted to. So we ended up doing a piece of legislation that was going to be a constitutional change on the ballot. I don't know if you remember this.
Yeah, I do. It was very complicated.
And it was the best I could do. So that was part of RPA. So it was the best I could do to get all the legislative leaders on board. So I was left to sell it. So I went out and sold it, and it bombed badly. I mean, that was a stinker in terms of the vote. So what I do, I woke up the next day, and you and your colleagues were there with your mics, thoughtfully so, asking, what I thought about it. And I said, well, I woke up this morning in a 6-foot deep pothole, and I had to get a ladder and climb out. And I'm just going to go back to work on infrastructure and roads. And we did, and we got something done eventually. But again, this is where you got to not take it personally, and you just got to say, how do you achieve a better outcome?
One thing that I thought was kind of interesting, I learned about this when we were doing a reporting project on migrant labor in Michigan. You were an advocate for creating a special visa that would have created an opportunity for high skilled workers to come into Detroit and address some of those population dynamics that you were talking about earlier. It seems like the Republican Party has kind of moved away from encouraging migration as kind of an economic development issue. And I'm wondering, what were the conversations around that proposal at the time? What kind of buy-in did you have from both parties? And, what's kind of happened on the immigration issue in particular? That one seems like, if we're talking about polarizing issues, that's probably one of the top ones.
Yeah, I think the important thing was to lay it out to people that there is an issue with illegal immigration. I mean, people crossing the border, and that's a tough issue, and I think that does need to be reformed. So, but separate from that, I quickly shifted to legal immigration to say there are visas out there. And I said, if anything, if you look at the state of Michigan in particular, the fastest way to grow our economy would be to get a whole bunch of visas for people to migrate into Michigan. And in particular, I sent something to President Obama saying, to help bring Detroit back faster and better, give me 50,000 green cards, which is unheard of. But that would have been the largest economic development boom in the history of the state of Michigan, short of the auto industry taking off a century ago. Because if you looked at it, the facts show that. So this is where I had to explain to my Republican colleagues, who sometimes were more anti-immigration. If you look at the data, again, shows that if you have an immigrant coming in that has some skill set, they on average are going to create not a job just for them, but they're going to create another job and a half for a Michigander. So it's actually going to create more career opportunities. And we were the only state that shrank in population. I mean, growing our population in Michigan is an important metric. And we turned it around where we sort of stabilized and we're bringing young people back. But if we could have brought in more people with these talented people, it was the right message. So I created an office for new Americans. We were one of 2 or 3 states to do that. And I still believe in it. I call it the Statue of Liberty play. Because isn't that something we stand for as a country? Or we used to. We need to get back to that.
In your experience, what were some of the biggest barriers to people working across the aisle in Lansing? And did you find that anything was helpful in overcoming them?
Yeah, we talked about a number, again, the social media, the media, the whole primary system. But a lot of it is people were too concerned as opposed to being able to take a risk. And that's not unusual in government or politics. People have to be willing to go out there and have something that may not go well. I set that tone early on when I became governor, because I said, if everything we worked on worked, it meant we weren't doing our job because we weren't pushing the envelope hard enough. And you never aspire to have it not work, but you had to be innovating, you had to be creating, or you had to think out of the box. And the interesting case is there was one time there was a protest going on. I apologize, I can't remember the specific bill, but it was a group that wanted to come in and talk to us about education. And I remember going to my conference room because I had a meeting with them. And there was a protest going on outside the Romney. And what happened is they walked in from the protest. They were out there protesting, yelling at me and stuff like that. They walked in the conference room. We had a meeting about the topic, and then they said, well, we got to get back to the protest. And the issue is they didn't, I don't mind that, but what they didn't do is they didn't go out to tell anybody in the protest they were actually in dialogue with us, because they were too worried about what would happen to them if they were spotted talking to us. And that's wrong. I mean, if you want to have that dialogue, fine, go out and protest, because I respect that. That's First Amendment. But at least go out and share the fact that you had an audience, that I'm listening, and that we're trying to work through something. But it was classic. These guys come in and from the protest and they, okay, we got to get back to the protest. Well, it's really great seeing you. Thanks for coming by.
I know that you had this sort of focus on relentless positive action early on, but really in your last year as governor, I would say I noticed you at least focusing a lot more on civility. I remember your last speech to the Mackinac Policy Conference was entirely rooted in that. For instance, was there a specific instance or a moment that you realized that was something you needed to focus on going forward, and even once you were out of office? Like, what triggered that for you, and how did you realize that it was as big of a crisis as it is?
I would say a couple things. One, it was gradual, so there isn't like one thing, but things did stand out. I mean, if you looked at the 2016 presidential election, the national election, that was an ugly election. I mean, across the board. I mean, just name calling and everything else, and getting away from people finding anything to work together. And then just watching things. An illustration that stood out, and again, this is people being negative instead of trying to govern or find common ground. I mean, you just find people attacking rather than saying they want to sit down and talk about what we could do together. That was troublesome. And then finally, as you said, Emily, it became more important in the end, because as I looked towards the future when I was no longer going to be governor, I wanted to make sure I could highlight an issue that is truly my concern of the greatest fear for our country, which is this lack of civility. So I think it's wonderful you're doing this project, but it's going to take a lot of years of healing and hard work to overcome it. One field that I hoped would have been a better illustration that, again, didn't work well under Trump and has not worked well under Biden was infrastructure. Because if you asked me, for both those presidents, the first thing I would have hoped they would have done is just go do a bipartisan infrastructure bill. Just to show people, again, that's part of RPA. It wasn't going to be 50% of the differences, but even if it's 5% of the differences, you could show you could work together. There's something to build on. And both times they got too convoluted, it got into too much politics or this divisiveness, rather than just saying, let's just go get a win together. So that's what I would encourage a lot of the message to be is, don't try to do the most gigantic things, but where it's clear there's common ground, just go get something done, but celebrate that. Again, that goes to my illustration about the 90-some% of bills. We would celebrate them in bill signings, but they weren't making headlines most of the time. I mean, we should be up on the rooftops yelling about how we did something together versus talking about what we didn't do together or why we don't like each other.
Yeah,
I think we keep coming back to this this idea that reaching across the aisle incurs a bit of personal risk, and I'm wondering if you think that there's a lack of leadership in our government, in our culture right now, people willing to kind of put themselves out there and, maybe assume some of the criticism that could come from people in their own camp by trying to work across the aisle.
Yeah, the good part is I haven't lost hope because there are people doing that every day still. And I know some of these people, and I'm talking from both directions, both from the Republican and Democratic side, which is great to see that there are people out there, willing to make those moves and stuff like that. We just need more of them. And again, it gets back to that presentation of talking about that and those successes. This is where the social media and the media, the commentators, that doesn't fit their narrative, the social media narrative either. I mean, very much. So it gets overwhelmed and it doesn't get the attention it should. So what would be great is if somehow we could call a big timeout and actually take a day, a week, a month to talk about how people are working together. Wouldn't that be refreshing? I don't know of anyone I know that wouldn't have a collective sigh of relief if they could actually think you could turn off the blast furnace of negativity and divisiveness and actually get a breath of fresh air of people talking about why they actually like somebody on the other side of the aisle, or how they actually went out to lunch, or they actually did something tangible in terms of legislation or a regulation or something that's making people's lives better.
A couple of weeks back when Facebook went down, I think we all did have a big collective sigh of relief. That was kind of nice.
Yeah. So if you guys start promoting, I'm happy to join that movement. Let me know.
Perfect. That actually, we were talking a little bit about, how to take this into a tangible realm, and that's a really good idea. I like it. One of the things I find myself wondering is, what would your message be to sort of the majority of Michiganders who aren't polarized? They aren't super on one end or super on the other end of the political spectrum, and are sort of starting to lose hope in the political system ever really reflecting what they want, and sort of the middle of the political spectrum that's getting ignored right now.
Yeah, a couple things. One is speak up. I mean, and again, when I say speak up, use RPA. Don't criticize other people, but say, I want to hear more positives. I mean, just think about what would happen if collectively this big group came out, just as we discussed, to say, I'm going to shut off all the divisive commentary. And I want to hear things that we can do together. And the middle is big enough that if there was the right channel, the right venue, the right mechanism, the right page, that would be a huge statement. And the trouble is the middle doesn't coalesce the same way. It's easy to coalesce on the extremes. But that's where your role, this project, could actually be helpful. So that's why I love talking to you. So that's one thing. The second thing is to encourage people to run for office still. People thought I was nuts. I mean, Michigan was in the tank. You had these movements going on. It was relatively divisive back then. And I ran for office with Sue's okay. Sue was, I gotta give her credit. So again, that's that marital harmony thing. So Sue said we should talk about me running for governor. But it was like one of the reasons when people would say, are you nuts? I would say, you just answered one of the reasons why I'm running. If you don't engage, if you don't go do something, how are you going to improve it? And it's not necessarily running for governor. And this is where I encourage people, run for community college trustee. I always use that as one of my illustrations to say, can you name your community college trustees? But isn't the community college at the forefront of giving training and creating jobs for people in need and for where we need to go in the future? Well, run to be a community college trustee. Get appointed to a position, but engage in the public sector in some fashion if you can in your lives. Because I appreciate many people financially can't do it, or it doesn't work right, or for various reasons. But if you can, engage.
We're talking about building relationships with other human beings. And I think part of what's contributed to some of this polarization is we just tend to associate more with people that we agree with or have things in common with. And that seems to be, we talk a lot in the media about this urban rural divide and, the population trends kind of driving that. You're a Republican who spent a good amount of his life in Ann Arbor, a pretty liberal progressive area. How have you developed those relationships in that community, and what do you do in your personal life to make sure that there are people around who have different points of view?
Yeah, the Ann Arbor case is an interesting one because, again, politically on the spectrum, I wouldn't be viewed as the mainstream in that community. But as a practical mayor, I've got tons of great friends because many cases, how you engage locally is about local politics or local activities. So one of the things I'm proud of is I was one of the people that helped create the Ann Arbor Spark, the economic development organization. But that gave me a chance to meet this huge array of people. And a lot of it was outreaching, creating great programs to help people from all over the economic spectrum. So it's about when people get to know you as a person, it changes the dynamic. And that's the problem with so many of the things we've talked about, the problems. Those tend to be something you don't get to know the person. You just get to know a kind of, I don't even know the right word, some definition of that person that person wouldn't even accept. I mean, the classic case I'll give you, Malachi, is we were talking about how we're both from Battle Creek. And you talked about how I'm from Ann Arbor. So when I was running for governor, I was viewed as this millionaire from Ann Arbor. And they would run campaigns about I was this wealthy guy, so I can't appreciate where people are coming from. And when we started talking, I told you I'm from North 22nd Street. I can guarantee you there weren't a lot of millionaires on North 22nd Street.
No, it's a humble neighborhood. Yeah,
it's a wonderful street and they're wonderful people. And I'm proud of my beginnings, but I never went out of my way because I had too much pride of being from North 22nd Street. I never wanted people to view it as I never lacked for anything, but I wasn't that millionaire person from day one, just having stuff given to me. I earned it. But again, that's the case of you need to look behind it or get to know the person, right?
Yeah, I think it's really easy to kind of throw labels on someone and then decide that you don't need to engage with them because they represent something that you just can't ever discuss. You can't engage with somebody because they're in this box of people that are kind of detestable or there's no way to engage a conversation with them.
So that's the part, again, this is the thing about people sort of define themselves that way or think that way versus taking that risk to assume you don't know this person, to say, what can I find out about this person that we have in common? Because that's true of virtually anyone from very different backgrounds. You can find common ground with almost anything. It may not be a big item. It could be a significant item you just don't know about. But shouldn't we be making the effort to say, if we find one thing in common, it's going to be easier to find that second thing, third thing, and then appreciate where they're coming from to follow through, to do something to be helpful in their lives.
Well, I want to be respectful of your time here and get you out soon, but are there any parting words you would leave us with or advice that you would give us as we embark on this project?
I would just summarize a little bit and just say how we started. So it's wonderful you're doing a project on civility because I view the lack of civility as the greatest threat to our country. If we can't get along with ourselves, we're in serious trouble. And the problem is we've been too successful for too many generations. So we take so many things for granted. And we take ourselves for granted that it's too easy to go on the attack against someone else. And we've created these mechanisms now that perpetuate that. So that's where we need to have these breakthrough moments where people are willing to go outside their comfort zone to say, maybe I do have something in common with that person. Maybe we can find some common ground, because when I say maybe, I know they can, but they have to believe that. And to get to that point of saying, let's start telling these positive stories and make that the premier thing we're focusing on, rather than why we're different or why someone wins and loses. We all have to win together. And I'm excited for our future still. I'm not down on things. I just think I'm hoping we're going through an extended cycle of poor judgment as a country, and that we'll break through this at some point and get back on a positive path, because I believe in relentless positive action.